The night after Pearl Harbor was a long one in Washington, the kind of night where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Inside the White House, lights burned in offices that were usually dark by midnight. Phones rang, typewriters clacked, and messengers hurried through corridors carrying scraps of paper that might shape the fate of the world. Outside, the Capitol lay silent beneath a winter sky, unaware that history had just taken a violent turn. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat alone for a few moments in his private study, his wheelchair positioned near the fireplace, though the fire had long since burned low. He stared at a map of the Pacific pinned to the wall. Red and blue pins dotted the vast ocean, marking islands most Americans could not find on a globe. Hawaii sat near the edge, its pin trembling slightly as the building's old heating system clicked and hummed. Pearl Harbor, the name echoed in his mind like a gunshot that refused to fade. The news had arrived in fragments at first. Confused reports of explosions, aircraft, ships burning. Then the full picture emerged, and with it, the realization that the United States was now fully and irrevocably at war. Roosevelt had already begun shaping his speech to Congress, but another decision pressed urgently upon him, one that could not wait until daylight. The Pacific Fleet lay shattered. Battleships were sunk or damaged, aircraft destroyed, thousands of sailors and soldiers killed or wounded. And in the midst of this wreckage, the question loomed: who would lead America's naval war in the Pacific? Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, the commander at Pearl Harbor, would soon be relieved. The nation needed a new leader, someone who could rebuild the fleet, restore morale, and take the fight to Japan across thousands of miles of open ocean. It was a choice that would shape not only the war, but the future of American power. Roosevelt rolled closer to the map, tracing the long arc from California to Japan with a finger. He knew the names of the Navy's most prominent admirals by heart. Ernest King, fierce and brilliant but notoriously difficult. William Halsey, aggressive, charismatic, beloved by sailors. Chester W. Nimitz, quieter, less famous, known mainly among naval circles as a submariner and logistics expert. Nimitz, the name did not leap off the page. To many in Washington, he was almost invisible. A staff officer, a thinker, not a battlefield commander. An Admiral Nobody Wanted, and yet Roosevelt could not shake the feeling that he was exactly the man the moment demanded. Across the country, in a modest house in Berkeley, California, Chester Nimitz slept restlessly. At 56, he carried the calm demeanor of someone who had spent most of his life at sea. But beneath that calm was a restless mind that rarely fully shut down. Even before the attack, he had sensed the gathering storm. For months, the Pacific had felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. He dreamed of water and steel, of ships moving silently through black seas, of distant thunder rolling across empty horizons. Then the phone rang. Nimitz awoke instantly, as if he had been waiting for the sound. He reached for the receiver, his heart already pounding. "Admiral Nimitz," he said. The voice on the other end was clipped, formal. "Sir, this is the Navy Department. The President requests that you report to Washington immediately." There was a brief pause, the kind that carried the weight of unspoken disaster. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. For a moment, Nimitz said nothing. His grip tightened on the phone. Images flooded his mind, the harbor he knew so well, the battleships lined up like silent giants, the sailors laughing on the decks just days before. He imagined them now in flames, and his chest tightened. "I understand," he said finally. He hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. His wife, Catherine, stirred beside him and looked up. "What is it?" she asked. He met her eyes. It started. They held each other in the dim light, neither speaking, both understanding that nothing would ever be the same. Within hours, Nimitz was on a train racing east, the landscape blurring past the windows. He spent the journey studying reports, maps, and telegrams. The scale of the disaster became clearer with each update. The Pacific Fleet had been dealt a crippling blow, and yet, somehow, the aircraft carriers had been at sea and escaped destruction. It was a slender thread of hope, but one that might prove decisive. When he arrived in Washington, the atmosphere was electric with urgency. Officers hurried through corridors, their faces pale and strained. In a quiet office, Nimitz finally met with Roosevelt. The president greeted him warmly, but there was no mistaking the gravity behind his smile. "Chester," Roosevelt said, using his first name as he often did with those he trusted. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Of course, Mr. President." Roosevelt gestured toward a chair. "Sit, we have much to discuss." They talked for hours. Roosevelt asked about submarines, supply lines, shipbuilding capacity, the psychology of sailors under extreme stress. Nimitz answered carefully, thoughtfully, never overstating, never dodging the hard truths. He spoke of the challenges of fighting across such vast distances, of the need for patience as well as aggression, of building a war machine that could sustain itself in the most remote corners of the ocean. At one point, Roosevelt leaned back, studying him. "You know, some of my advisors think we need a more flamboyant commander. Someone who inspires confidence just by walking into a room." Nimitz nodded. "There are men like that, sir, but—" Roosevelt continued, "I'm not convinced that's what we need most right now. We need someone who can think 3 steps ahead, who understands logistics as well as tactics, who can turn chaos into order." Nimitz said nothing, waiting. Roosevelt rolled closer, his eyes sharp. "I want you to take command of the Pacific Fleet." For a heartbeat, the room seemed to fall silent. Nimitz felt the weight of the words settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. "Yes, sir," he said simply. As he left the White House, the enormity of the task ahead pressed down on him. He was to take over a shattered fleet, face a confident and battle-hardened enemy, and fight across an ocean larger than all the continents combined. The odds were staggering. Some in the Navy Department openly questioned the choice. Nimitz lacked the dramatic flair of Halsey, the fiery intensity of King. He had spent years in administrative roles, refining systems, managing logistics, working behind the scenes. To critics, he seemed like a safe, even dull, selection. But Roosevelt saw something else. He saw a steady hand in a storm, a mind capable of orchestrating a conflict that would be as much about supply chains and production schedules as about guns and bombs. When Nimitz arrived in Pearl Harbor just days later, the devastation confronted him in full. The harbor still smelled of smoke and oil. Sunken battleships lay tilted in the water, their hulls scarred and blackened. Twisted metal jutted from the surface like broken bones. Sailors moved quietly along the docks, their faces grim, their eyes haunted. Nimitz stood on the deck of a small boat as it carried him across the harbor, taking in the scene. He said nothing. He did not offer speeches or promises. He simply watched, absorbing every detail. At one point, he turned to a nearby officer. "How long until we can get the ships back in action?" The officer hesitated. "Months, sir. Some of them, maybe never." Nimitz nodded. "Then we'll build new ones." It was not bravado. It was a statement of fact. In the weeks that followed, Nimitz worked relentlessly. He reorganized command structures, streamlined communication channels, and pushed shipyards into round-the-clock production. He emphasized training, discipline, and adaptability. Mistakes were acknowledged, analyzed, and corrected, not hidden or punished. He visited hospitals, speaking quietly with wounded sailors. He walked the decks of damaged ships, listening to engineers explain what could be salvaged and what could not. He made it a point to learn names, to remember faces, to show that he saw the human cost of every decision. Slowly, morale began to lift. The men saw in him not a distant figurehead, but a commander who understood their world. The first real test came sooner than anyone expected. By early 1942, Japanese forces were advancing rapidly, capturing island after island, pushing deeper into the Pacific. Their confidence was high, their momentum seemingly unstoppable. American forces, still reeling, struggled to keep pace. Then came intelligence reports of a Japanese plan to seize Midway Island, a small but strategically vital outpost. If Midway fell, Hawaii itself would be threatened. Nimitz faced a stark choice. His available forces were limited. The fleet was still rebuilding. To challenge the Japanese now would be to gamble everything on a single, risky engagement. In a tense meeting with his senior officers, arguments flew across the table. Some urged caution, warning that defeat could be catastrophic. Others pressed for bold action, believing that surprise and determination might tip the scales. Nimitz listened quietly, his fingers steepled, his gaze distant. When the room finally fell silent, he spoke. "We will take the risk," he said, "but we will not do so blindly." He placed his trust in intelligence, particularly in cryptographers who had managed to partially break Japanese naval codes. Their work suggested not only the target, but the timing of the attack. Armed with this knowledge, Nimitz devised a plan to ambush the Japanese fleet near Midway. It was a daring strategy, one that depended on perfect coordination and a measure of luck. If it failed, the consequences would be dire. As the American carriers sailed to their positions, tension gripped the fleet. Pilots checked and rechecked their planes. Deck crews moved with quiet efficiency. Below decks, sailors wrote hurried letters home, uncertain if they would ever have the chance to send another. On June 4, 1942, the battle began. From thousands of miles away, Nimitz waited for news, surrounded by maps and radio equipment. Reports came in fragments. Enemy aircraft sighted, American planes launched, heavy losses among torpedo squadrons. Hours passed in agonizing suspense. Then the message arrived. American dive bombers had caught the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment, their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. In a matter of minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were ablaze. By the end of the day, the 4th would be sunk as well. The Battle of Midway was a stunning victory, a turning point that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. A fleet that had seemed invincible was suddenly vulnerable. When Nimitz received confirmation, he closed his eyes briefly, then exhaled. There was no celebration, no triumphant speech, only a quiet acknowledgement of the cost. Hundreds of American lives had been lost, but the strategic gain was immense. From that moment on, the war in the Pacific began to change. Under Nimitz's leadership, the United States adopted a strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified enemy positions and capturing key islands that could serve as airfields and supply bases. It was a methodical, relentless advance, driven as much by logistics as by firepower. Each operation was carefully planned, each risk calculated. Nimitz trusted his commanders, granting them autonomy while maintaining overall strategic coherence. He fostered cooperation between the Navy, the Marines, and the Army, smoothing over rivalries that might otherwise have crippled joint operations. As the fleet grew in size and strength, American power spread across the Pacific like a rising tide. New ships poured from shipyards, their hulls gleaming, their crews eager to prove themselves. Aircraft carriers, once precious and scarce, became the backbone of naval strategy. Yet for all the successes, the war remained brutal. Battles like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan exacted a terrible toll. Nimitz read casualty lists late into the night, each name a reminder of the human cost of command. He carried those losses quietly, sharing little of his burden. To the outside world, he remained calm, composed, unflappable. Only those closest to him saw the strain in his eyes. As the American advance drew closer to Japan, the stakes grew ever higher. The enemy fought with increasing desperation, launching kamikaze attacks that stunned and horrified Allied forces. Ships were struck, sailors killed in sudden, violent explosions. Still, Nimitz pressed forward. He understood that every mile gained shortened the war, saved lives in the long run, and brought the end closer. In Washington, Roosevelt followed the campaign closely, exchanging frequent messages with his chosen admiral. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of crisis, deepened into mutual respect and trust. When Roosevelt died in April 1945, Nimitz felt the loss keenly. The man who had taken a chance on him, who had seen potential where others saw obscurity, was gone. But the course they had set together continued. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood on the brink of defeat. American forces had seized key islands, their bombers striking the Japanese homeland. The final decisions loomed, heavy with moral and strategic weight. When the war finally ended, Nimitz stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay as Japan formally surrendered. The sun glinted off the water, the harbor crowded with Allied ships. It was a moment of solemn triumph, a culmination of years of sacrifice. As he looked out over the assembled fleet, Nimitz reflected on the path that had brought him there. From the quiet hours after Pearl Harbor, through the uncertainty and terror of early defeats to the hard-won victories that followed, the journey had been shaped by countless decisions, large and small. History would record his name alongside the great commanders of the war. But he would always remember the doubts, the whispers that he was not the obvious choice, not the bold hero many had wanted. Perhaps that was precisely why he had succeeded. He had not sought glory, he had sought effectiveness. He had built a machine capable of sustaining a global campaign, and he had trusted in preparation, intelligence, and the steady application of overwhelming force. In the years after the war, as he returned to a quieter life, people often asked him how it felt to have led such a vast enterprise, to have commanded millions of men and thousands of ships. He usually smiled and deflected the praise. "I had very good people working with me," he would say, "and we did what had to be done." But in quieter moments, he would think back to that night in Washington, to the soft glow of lamplight and the map on the wall, to a president weighing impossible choices. He would remember the moment when history turned on a simple decision, on the selection of an admiral nobody wanted. And he would know, deep down, that leadership is not always about being the loudest voice in the room or the most dramatic presence. Sometimes it is about steadiness, humility, and the courage to shoulder an unimaginable burden without complaint. The world had needed a calm hand in a time of chaos. Against expectations, that hand had been his.